Welcome to the Crash Labs. Today I've got Gerry Butts. Can I call you Gerry?
Sure.
Or Gerald?
Sure, either one's fine by me, Danny.
Great. Okay, well, listen, I'll give a brief introduction. So it's really a treat to have Gerry in today. Gerry is the former Principal Secretary of Canada and the previous CEO of WWF Canada, World Wildlife Foundation. At one time, the most powerful non-elected person in Parliament Hill. Number 5 most influential in Toronto, and Maclean's Magazine's 14th most powerful Canadian in 2016. A key architect to the Trudeau victory and the modern Liberal platform. Gerry's currently a vice chairman of the Eurasia Group, a global political risk consultancy. So welcome, Gerry.
It's great to be here.
Did I miss anything?
I'm sure you did. Most importantly, a proud Cape Brettoner.
A proud Cape Brettoner, great. Well, we were just talking prior to turning the cameras on about how amazing the East Coast is, and it's just different. I'm from the Ottawa Valley, not too far away.
The East Coast of Ontario.
The East Coast of Ontario, exactly. Yeah. So look, I mean, obviously you've had a phenomenal career. What achievement have you had in your career, professionally, let's say, that you're most proud of?
Oh, that's a great question, Denny. I think the one thing I'd like to make perfectly clear is that none of the things that you just described are attributable to me alone. All of them happen because you are fortunate enough to work with a great team of people, and I have been for all of my career, especially and including Eurasia Group, which is we're densely populated with some of the best, hardest working and smartest people I've ever met in my life from all over the world. But if you were looking at kind of public policy achievements, I think the thing I'm proudest of would be actually a couple of things. One would be the Greenbelt, which I helped Premier McGuinty implement back in the early part of this century, which sounds like a long time ago. Now it is, I guess, a long time ago. It'll be a colleague from that era was reminding me that it'll be 20 years this October since Dalton McGuinty was elected Premier of Ontario, which feels a lot longer ago than it was, but it was. So the Greenbelt, the coal retirement, the education reforms, a lot of the things I'm proudest of are the things that I was part of my first go around in politics in Ontario. Federally, easily, the climate plan and the Canada Child Benefit, which has, I think about the Canada Child Benefit a lot because there are hundreds of thousands of kids who are growing up, who aren't growing up in poverty. And when you think about the kind of force multiplier of that as their lives go on, what they'll be able to accomplish and achieve and the opportunities they'll have that they wouldn't have had we not won the 2015 election.
Yeah, kids are such an important investment in the future.
Absolutely.
Of all, of our economy, of our social fabric, of everything, right?
Oh, yeah. So, it's a great measurement of how just a society is, how they treat their kids.
Yeah. You don't have to answer this one. This is more of a fun question. So you and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau go way back to the university years and, of course, played a critical role in partnering up with the Prime Minister to win an election. One of the interesting things on that docket was the legalization of marijuana. Right. Did you guys kind of ode back to the university days? Twist went up, crank the big shiny tunes.
You know what? The truth is that I probably partook more than Prime Minister Trudeau did in our university days. In fact, definitely did, because he didn't really smoke at all, and never really has. And he sort of came at this issue. There was this incident with his brother where his brother was in a car accident on the prairies on a drive back from the West Coast. And it struck him that he was found, he had a small amount of marijuana in his possession at the time. And I remember Justin saying that, with my family's connections, Misha will have no problem getting off. But if you're an Indigenous kid or a Black kid, in Regina or Toronto, and this happens to you, you could be facing jail time, and that's not fair. Yeah. So that was kind of where he came at it from. My perspective was that in a society where we not only have legal alcohol, but seem to encourage people to drink at every time they open their eyes and look at a billboard, it was kind of ridiculous to have a substance that was a lot less harmful, illegal,
completely illegal. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. How many times did you guys watch The Inconvenient Truth and Who Killed the Electric Car?
You know what? That's a good question. I remember when An Inconvenient Truth came out. I remember it vividly because I was still in the premier's office.
Yeah.
And we were in the middle of the coal retirement. And at the time we had pitched the coal retirement less as a climate mitigation policy and more as a way to tackle the exploding rates of childhood asthma that Ontario was facing. And of course, I'm driving here and in a Uber on the way here, I couldn't help but notice that, and you can hear it in both of our voices, that the air is full of forest fire smoke here in Ottawa yet again.
Yeah, it's pretty hazy here.
Yeah,
so,
and we were very proud that we brought the number of smog days in Ontario from something like 65 to 0 because of the coal retirement plan. And here we are 10 years later dealing with it again because of forest fires accelerated by climate change. So, it's hard to get away from that issue.
So you're a big proponent of intermediary, or I guess interventionism vis-a-vis climate change and taking action. But it's interesting to hear that the real principal driver for your early career in phasing out coal was, or thermal plants, let's say coal plants, was really driven by air pollution.
Absolutely. I mean, it was. We certainly were aware that it was, and I think it still is, Denny. I think it's still the largest single climate mitigation project in the world, and I don't think Canadians celebrate it that much. We took 7,550 megawatts of coal offline in Ontario over the course of 10 years and did it voluntarily.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody has matched that yet. You could probably aggregate different U.S. states and come to a similar number, but it was certainly ahead of its time. And Dalton, whose wife still is an elementary school teacher, noticed how prevalent puffers were in elementary classrooms all over Ontario. I can remember vividly his pitch on this was something to the effect of, I defy anybody to go into an elementary school class in Ontario anywhere and not find 2 or 3 kids with a puffer. And it doesn't have to be this way.
Was there an increased rate of puffer usage in proximity to?
There was.
Thermal coal plants?
And it was worse in the Greater Golden Horseshoe down the 401 to London, where the coal plants were in Mississauga and in Sarnia, Lambton, the biggest one being in Nanacoke on the shores of Lake Erie in what I would call South Central Ontario, but it all kind of came to the Greater Toronto area. And it was there it met, of course, all of the exhaust from cars in the Greater Toronto area, and it was just causing pulmonary problems, especially amongst kids, that we'd never seen before in the province. So it really was a public health issue.
Well, I've got an interesting kind of segue off of that question, something tangential, I guess, to that. I listened to your address for the Canadian Nuclear Association.
Right.
And recently the Trudeau government has been quite pro-nuclear. And these days, even Stephen Guilbeault, who is, quite fervently anti-nuke at Greenpeace, has now kind of changed his tune. And so I would encourage anybody listening to go and listen to that, but maybe take us through your views on nuclear power and maybe the need to, or why we're seeing people that were maybe, from a climate perspective concerned about nukes, or maybe even nuclear power, and then kind of switching over to we'll call it the dark side, or the atom, let's say,
the iridescent side.
Yeah.
Well, I've never been anti-nuclear, and we, in the McGuinty years, again, we engaged in, I think, the largest greenfield procurement process for nuclear power in 30 years, right? And while there's a lot of mythology about how the coal plants were retired, fundamentally it was about rebuilding Ontario's nuclear fleet. And it was long and it was costly, but it was worth it. And we're at a period in the evolution of the climate where you cannot rule out zero emission sources of energy. And they should be put on a competitive footing with each other. But nuclear has a lot, can deliver a lot that other sources of energy can't, most notably reliable baseload power, which an industrialized economy, at least at this stage of the development of the grid, really needs. So I think it's a good move that we're seeing a bit of a nuclear renaissance in Ontario that I would say started in the McGuinty years and is continuing in the Ford government, that they're making some very smart decisions to build new nuclear and to refurbish old nuclear.
Did you discover anything about nuclear and why it was so important and critical in that sort of, I mean, let's say you were looking at it from a renewables perspective,
Yeah.
and a lot of times we hear that from activists and, environmentalists, things like that, where we want to switch from, fossil fuels to renewables, but there's, you still need nuclear. Like, what was it about kind of that, going through that process with OPG at that time, kind of learning about that is?
Well, it was OPG and Bruce. And importantly, I think, Denny, that what Ontario had going for it, obviously, that most jurisdictions didn't, was we already had 14,000 megawatts of nuclear, right? And I'm not sure there would have been, in the last part of the last, or 2 decades ago, I guess the 08-09 period when it really it really kicked off. I'm not sure there was another jurisdiction in the world that had 2 or 3 communities that wanted a new nuclear plant, right?
Right.
And that's important for the long-term sustainability of any electricity infrastructure, that the communities where it's built and through which it's built want the infrastructure there and see the local benefit from having it. And we had that in Bruce County and in Pickering and in Darlington, right? So there were already 3 communities in Ontario that wanted more nuclear because they had historically seen the benefits of it. Now, I don't want to come off as someone who doesn't see the downside of nuclear. And to me, it's can it be cost competitive with modern renewables at scale over the long term? And that's a huge challenge, right? It's a difficult. Most things in life are not rocket science. Nuclear energy is rocket science. And you have to have a long-term commitment, as we do here in Ontario, to educate the workforce that's going to run those plants for as long as they're running. And they also have to be cost competitive. That we've seen there are numerous projects you can name, from the Gentilly plant in France to the Finnish plant that just came online to the problems they're having in the United Kingdom. There are lots and lots of examples of cost overruns that, had they been known at the beginning of the process, would have rendered nuclear non-competitive with alternative sources. But in a jurisdiction where you already have about half of your baseload power supplied by nuclear, it would be kind of insane to retire it all.
Now, I think one of the interesting,
or German.
Or German, yeah, well, exactly.
Insane or German.
Right, fair enough. I think one of the interesting quotes I wrote down from that was that you noticed that there was sort of like a theology to this, and versus the math.
Yeah,
maybe
well,
expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. That was Tom Mitchell, who is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He literally was a rocket scientist. He operated nuclear submarines for the U.S. Navy. And I think he's still head of the Nuclear World Safety organization. Brilliant guy. He was CEO of OPG at the time. And we were trying to figure out how we were going to retire this 7,500 megawatts of coal. And I remember vividly in one of the cabinet committee discussions about it, he said, it was either before or after to the premier, he said, you and your folks are thinking, you can't think about this like it's theology, it's math class. And you've got to think about it like an engineer, and how you're going to go about taking off X number of megawatts over what time and what you're going to replace them with. And if you think about it like an engineering flowchart, then you can accomplish it in a reasonable period of time. But you'd be sacrificing the reliability of the grid if you simply shut these plants down without a reasonable plan to replace them. And he was absolutely right. And we kind of worked with him and with the newly instituted OPA at the time, the Ontario Power Authority, and the great public servants in Ontario to design, and the business community, to design a reasonable time frame over which the Ontario economy could absorb that massive structural change, which it did.
Now, how much of the sort of climate activism would you say is theology versus how many of them are mathematicians?
Well, I think your base rate there is the general population, and the general population is not densely populated with mathematicians. So it's, and I don't mean
it's a bit of a softball.
That's just the way it is, right? Yeah. That's the way it is. So I have two teenagers, and I can understand the sense of anxiety and urgency that especially younger people feel about the climate crisis. And I'm with them. I have been my whole career. I think that we've done a lot, but we haven't done enough, and we haven't done it quickly enough. And as a consequence, there, you know, several million pounds of carbon in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there, and they're going to have to live with the consequences of that. I've said this on past occasions, but the most pernicious aspect of climate change causing emissions is that they persist, right? So the stuff we're putting up there now is going to be creating the climate that our kids are dealing with 20, 30, 40 years from now, depending on the source of the emissions. So I just think we've lost a lot of time. Right?
I think it's interesting that the word theology gets chosen because, I mean, I think for a lot of critics, let's say, the opposition to, it's hard to say that I'm not even sure there's really a ton of opposition in the sense of like a lot of people saying we shouldn't do anything about climate.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that may poke at the urgency or the expediency of interventionism, you know, and the execution of that, whether it be here or Europe, other places that we've seen. And they're pointing to economic shock that's coming down. And a lot of times we'll hear, you know, this whole climate movement is turning into a bit of a religion for some. Do you think there's truth in that? I mean, at least at the extreme ends of things?
I think there's probably truth in both sides, right? That there's religion in the denialist movement, and I certainly have faced it on social media over the course of my career. And there's religion on the far end of the environmentalist movement, the deep ecology movement. And I can understand both sides, but to me, I keep coming back to this. It's not a political issue. It's not a theological issue. It's an issue of physics and chemistry.
Sure.
The ocean used to be here. It's going to be, because of thermal expansion, it's going to be there. We used to be able to live comfortably at certain latitudes. Soon we will not be able to. And these are all facts of science, right? We can, using sophisticated modeling, we can predict pretty accurately what's going to happen. And most of what scientists have told us would happen has happened so far. So if you're a rational person looking at that set of circumstances, the only rational response is, what do we do to arrest this process as quickly as possible? Because the downside consequences, you talked about the economic shocks of the energy transition, you always have to weigh that in balance with the cost of doing nothing. Right. And the cost of doing nothing is astronomically higher than the cost of carbon abatement.
Well, it's been difficult. I think one of the things that the climate movement, let's say, I'm going to try to add labels to things,
Sure.
even though maybe it's inappropriate to add those sorts of labels. But I think one of the challenges up against the climate movement is the fact that these shocks are so visceral and so tangible. People do see their grocery bills going higher, or their fuel price increasing, or you know, instability, let's say, in their grids, et cetera. The dependability of things, and they can feel that and measure that, but they can't really feel and measure the overall carbon.
Well, they can certainly feel and measure the imminent and recent effects of climate change, right? If we were in Phoenix having this conversation today, or Bilbao, Spain, or Tokyo, Japan, or any number of other Mumbai, we'd be experiencing anomalous heat events that unfortunately are not going to be anomalous for much longer, right?
Fair enough.
So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, and this is an important point, because these fights have to be fought by somebody as the transition is happening. What has caused these price spikes in energy over the past couple of years has been the fundamental geopolitical unreliability of fossil fuels, right? That energy prices spiked globally because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and because of the rational response of European policymakers to no longer depend on Russian fossil fuels for the reliability of their energy system. And had we been having this conversation a year ago, February, there were maybe even a majority of forecasters saying that the European energy system was going to fall apart without access to cheap Russian gas. Here we are a year and a half later, it didn't happen, right? So I think that there's always a struggle. One of the most underrated or underappreciated sources of power in any system at equilibrium is the inertial force of the status quo, right? And the status quo in the current energy system is fossil fuel and the people who and organizations that most of which are state-owned enterprises that extract and burn it. So if you're thinking about it from a forward looking perspective, you have to design a strategy to get off of that system, which after all has created the climate crisis, and replace it with one that doesn't emit carbon. That sounds like an easy thing to do. After all, carbon for millions of years was in a safe place, either under the ground, and we took it from that and put it into unsafe places in the ocean and in the atmosphere. We've got to stop doing that.
Yeah.
It's not that complicated. And we not only do we have to stop doing that, we probably have to design a way we have to figure out a way to get it from the unsafe places we put it in and put it back into safe places underground. So those are two big things. We're not going to get there if we keep adding to the problem every year.
Do you think maybe though, there is also a real danger in possibly not controlling the fringe kind of sides of that argument, like the extreme ends, let's say, of we'll call it the real doomsday climate kind of end.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's real, we don't hear a lot of renouncing sort of some of what the extreme end is saying coming from that side of the argument? Not a ton of it. And do you fear that maybe if goals aren't met in timeframes that we've set out, things like that could provoke a different kind of instability?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. I think that a lot of terms, though, get thrown around like doomsday. I'm not a climate doomer. I'm not one of those people. I think that we're not facing a species extinction level event here. We're changing the climate of the planet, so it's going to be a lot harder for people to live on it. Right, which is a different thing. So I'm not in that camp, and I think I should say that. All that said, scientists more and more sound like alarmists because they're alarmed, right? And they're looking at their models, they are examining the data, they're watching what's happening in the real world to ocean surface temperatures, for instance, or the increased prevalence of wildfires or the concentration of typhoons and hurricanes. And they're saying what needs to happen in order for people to wake up and get their act together. But
are all of them saying that?
Scientists?
All of them.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there are some who, for a variety of reasons, don't say that.
Right.
But most of the scientists that I know that look at the data are quite alarmed by it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it touches me because I'm an earth science is my forte. Yeah. And one of the things that I did my thesis on was solar forcing on the hydrological cycle. Yeah. And so I understand how sophisticated and the business that we built was really, machine learning and artificial intelligence and trying to combine a multitude of geological and geochemical data sets to provide effective and meaningful predictions on what are very complicated Earth's natural systems.
Absolutely.
And so I understand very well the challenges around building accurate models. And, you can build an accurate model, but there's also a lot of pitfalls. And so one of the things that I think concerns me when I look at the IPCC or when I look at a lot of the scientists that opine on this space is that one of the things we learned, and not to kind of fill up your time with,
it's okay.
With this
I'm a total geek on this stuff. I'd love to talk about it. You may be turning your listeners off, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, hopefully I won't turn them off either. But no, from my perspective, I think one of the things that we went against IBM in the mining space.
Right.
And one of the challenges one of the things we recognized, I should say, in building these models is that it's garbage in, garbage out.
Of course.
And so one of the most difficult things is to come up with, first of all, very clean, reliable, homogeneous data sets. So you're dealing with a multivariate problem.
Right.
And then you need to have domain experts basically cleaning those data sets and checking them for flaws, things like that. And then once you have a bunch of clean data sets, then you go through your predictive, your model, right? Your machine learning. And then you also need those domain experts to check the results.
Right, of course.
And so you need to kind of sandwich it with domain expertise. And so one of the challenges I have when I look at this, at least as far as I can say from a political or even the information that a lot of people are receiving, right, in their headsets or over the computer, is you get a lot of non-domain experts in text, interpreting the results. And this was something that we had an edge over IBM on because IBM has a tremendous machine learning team, data science team. I mean, probably the best in the world, if not one of the best in the world. Next to say OpenAI or other groups like that. And data scientists, when we started our business, were few and far between. So we were, we used to call it collecting Pokemon. We'd look for like geologists that also had a dual discipline of data science. And what was interesting about that is if you take all of, let's say we want to have, we want to see if we can train a model on how to predict where the next gold mine or copper mine would be. So we'd say, okay, copper mines, we're going to put in electromagnetic data, which is, basically flown from helicopters. Our entire country is covered with basically airborne EM data. We would have geochemical data, lake sediment data, the geology, etc. And the list goes on. But one of the key flaws that you'd have in this sort of realm of geophysics is that as a training set. So you'd say, okay, well, here's a bunch of examples of copper mines. And so we want to figure out what feature carries the most weight. What's the most important feature to and rank order them. Yeah, to weight the features appropriately, right? To give you the best results. And one of the interesting things that would jump out if you weren't a domain expert doing this exercise is that power lines would jump out because power lines are hyperconductive and it's a feature that the computer can reliably distinguish. And every major copper mine basically has infrastructure and has power lines going to it. So, it's hard for the system to differentiate. Do power lines matter? Now, obviously, you and I talking know that power line is a total red herring. Right. It shouldn't matter at all. Right. And so I think this is a data bias issue. There's a lot of precision issues with this type of stuff. And so my concern is that I know there's brilliant people working on this problem, probably way smarter than me or my team or whatever, right? Let's say, or just in sheer numbers. But I guess I'm more concerned about the accuracy of the models, of the predictions, and being very careful not to catch. It's who's interpreting these results at the end. I think that's maybe what I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I would, for listeners we're probably down to half a dozen now, but for the hardy few that are left who are really deeply interested in this topic, I could not recommend more highly a book by an Oxford physicist named Tim Palmer called The Primacy of Doubt.
Yeah.
And Palmer was one of the key people who developed the modern approach to weather forecasting. Right. So what we used to do with weather forecasts is there are about 1 billion variables in any weather forecast. And we would, whenever the model got the forecast wrong, we would go back and tweak the original model and try and figure out which one of those variables needed to be enhanced or diminished in order to provide a more accurate forecast. What Palmer figured out was he applied ensemble forecasting to weather, that it wasn't so much, the math wouldn't allow you to predict because of quirks of the Lorentz attractor. I'm not going to get into the Lorentz attractor. You couldn't really predict beyond 2 weeks in any in using any model, however robust it was, what was going to happen with the weather. But if you slightly changed a given number of variables and ran a similar model 50 times, then you would end up with a probabilistic forecast. So when all of your listeners will know that when they open their weather app in the morning or they turn on the radio, they get a forecast that says something like there's a 30% chance of rain today.
Sure.
Most people think that that means, well, maybe it'll rain in 30% of the area covered by the forecast. Maybe it means there's a slight chance of rain. What it precisely means is that someone has run that model 50 times, and in 30% of those outcomes, it rained. So the important part is not so much the process that goes into it. The important part is the self-correcting aspect of it. So at the end of the year, when weather forecasters sit down and look at what happened that year versus what they predicted, they expect to find that of all of the days they predicted a 30% chance of rain, it rained 30% of the time, right? And that model sort of expanded to predict, as Palmer puts it in the book, and again, I couldn't recommend this more highly, climate change is about changing the overall statistics of weather, right? It's about enhancing the probability of certain events. And for instance, it's much more probable that we break all-time high record temperatures and much less probable that we break all-time lows, right? Which sounds like a really simple thing. But when you run that model at that sophistication repeatedly over extended periods of time, you get a very good sense of what the climate is going to look like. And most importantly, it pretty much has turned out as was predicted, right? We are at about 1.3, 1.4 degrees of warming, which in 2023, which is roughly what the models predicted back in the 90s.
Well, if we go back to when a lot of the policy came through on this, and a lot of this interventionism kind of came through for the energy transit, et cetera, which, fair enough. A lot of I think it was the first 4 versions of IPCC's model called for 5 degrees over the next century by 2100, let's say. Warming.
Well,
that's been corrected.
That was the end of the tail, and it's largely been corrected because we've decreased the rate of carbon emissions.
Well, but a lot of people said that, in working group, I think it was 1 and 2 in the most recent report, they pointed out that a lot of that has to do with the fact that the hydrological system wasn't adequately modeled initially, and neither was the solar forcing.
The big thing we don't know for sure is what effect clouds are going to have on climate change.
Yeah.
But in the balance of probabilities and all the running of the models, the impact is negative, not positive. Now, so the flip side of what you're saying, Denny, and it's a really important point you're making, because we're operating, the old joke, I think it was, whether he said it or not, he was credited with saying at Yogi Berra, the problem with the future is it hasn't happened yet.
Sure.
Right. Ultimately, you fall back on the kind of the precautionary principle, right? That we know on a balance of probabilities what's happening, largely because it has happened, and we can observe it continuing to happen. So what is the risk assessment calculation you make, and how do you mitigate the downsides of that risk? Because what you're saying, I don't want to say inaccuracy because it's not inaccurate, but the precision of modeling. Nobody, even the most sophisticated modeler, will tell you that there are going to be mistakes in models.
We can all agree that the precision is way
it's not what people think.
It's a range of scenarios,
right?
We don't know. The best we can get is range, and it's rather large.
It's rather large, but to the best of our knowledge, the balance of probabilities more than suggest that the trajectory we're on now is a negative one on balance, right? And I don't think you'd hear any modeler disagree with that assessment. Once you agree with that assessment, you have to then do a risk assessment calculation about what is the cost of change versus the status quo. And so much of the argument has been about the level of precision in the forecasting, which we don't even, we wouldn't apply to anything else really. If I were your doctor and I said to you that your LDL cholesterol levels are X, and if you don't do something about them, then you have a 65% chance of having a heart attack in the next 5 years. chances are you'd exercise more and change your diet, right?
For sure.
And fundamentally, that's what's happening in the climate.
I think both sides of the argument on this are landing on CO2 is a problem and it needs to be intervened. Like we need to intervene
and
on this.
That itself is progress.
Yeah.
Right. When I started working on this issue, it was still common, very common, for people to say an increase in CO2 is on balance good for the planet because there'll be more plants.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the models didn't predict that, did they? The 15% greening that we've had in the last decade.
Yeah, but a lot of that is because we have intervened, right?
Right.
We have, especially in North America, we've replanted forests that we have taken down. And I mean, afforestation and deforestation are still bigger problems than reforestation can make up for.
Well, if there's more from an ecological perspective, I've heard the argument, and again, I'm not an ecologist and I'm not, to any stretch, but I've heard the argument said that, if there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than basically the little pores on the undersides of leaves that, perform and release,
oxygen
or water vapor, I guess.
Water vapor.
They would retain, more water because there's just an abundance of carbon dioxide, let's say. So they're more resilient, let's say, in areas that are more arid. And then we've seen that a greening in arid areas.
Yeah, unless they all burn down from wildfires caused by climate change.
Yeah.
Right. Which we've also seen.
Anyway, I'll just move on from that. I've got a kind of a fun list of people because you've got, you're pretty outspoken on Twitter.
Although I've taken a hiatus. I'm not sure I'm going
I see that. I've been following you on Twitter. Looks like you've taken a bit of a break, but just a few questions and maybe give me like one word, if you could, on these people. Michael Mann.
Pioneer.
Bjorn Lomborg.
Charlatan.
Steve Koonin.
Don't know.
You don't know Stephen Koonin?
I don't think so. I might, but I'm not sure.
David Attenborough.
Oh, he's an icon.
Okay. Judith Curry. Do you know Judith Curry?
I might. I'd have to see these people's Twitter avatar before I.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Well, Vandana Shiva. She's like anti-GMO,
I know.
India, whole thing, Sri Lanka.
I don't know enough about crop science to have an informed opinion.
Okay, here's a few. You got to know these ones. Elon Musk.
Disappointing.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. But he pioneered electric cars.
Well, it depends on who you talk to. He certainly built the company around someone's invention of electric
Well,
cars.
fair enough. But I mean, the commercial case for electric cars.
I have an EV. It's not a Tesla. I love modern EVs. I think they are going to take over the auto sector a lot more quickly than people are currently appreciating, especially in North America. And I think he's played a huge role in that. I also think that his stewardship of one of the most important social media platforms has given voice to climate deniers in a way that's been really harmful to the progress on the issue. And
am I a climate denier from my questions?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, I was just wondering. Yeah,
but there are look, there's a well-financed campaign.
Yeah,
that's out there to discredit people who want to see action on climate change, often by attacking them personally. And Twitter has become the main platform for that kind of attack. And I think that that's a really unfortunate turn of events. He could have been one of and he may still turn out to be, life is many days. He could have been on the Mount Rushmore of people who solved the climate problem, but he's muddied his own legacy by his stewardship of that platform.
Okay. What about?
That's more than one word.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, you gave me a word, and
Musk
I went past it.
Probably deserves more than one word.
Sure. Mark Zuckerberg.
Interesting. He's got a chance to turn his own public profile and legacy around at this stage. And Scott Galloway, who's a public intellectual I admire a lot, has spoken eloquently about the opportunity Zuckerberg has now. But he's also got huge problems to solve with. There should be real age gating on Instagram. His companies are causing an epidemic of body image problems and real diseases, in particular amongst teenage girls.
Do you see that documentary?
No, I didn't.
What's it called? The Social Network?
Oh, that's a movie. I've seen the movie.
You're
talking
sorry,
about
not
the David
this-
Fincher movie. That's a
Yeah,
great movie.
no. There's a Netflix documentary
I
about
haven't
social
seen
media
it.
platforms. Oh, fuck, it's fascinating.
Well, look, I mean, I have teenagers. I get this problem, and I see the way they interact with their friends, and the homogeneity it's created, especially amongst teenage girls. And it's a really tough. I mean, look, I was a teenager a long time ago, but not that long ago that I don't recall the nauseating insecurity of being a teenager
Mhm.
and having to put yourself on display publicly 24 hours a day
For likes.
Is not a healthy thing. So I think he could go a long way to detoxifying the public sphere if he truly wanted to. He has the resources and the reach to do it.
Mm-hmm. What about?
And we didn't even really talk about Myanmar, which is, these are serious things.
Yeah. Well, with the election, I guess.
Yeah.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates, I have a lot of admiration for Bill Gates. I think that, I think the Gates Foundation has done incredible things, in particular on public health.
Mm-hmm.
He is a techno optimist skewing utopian on climate. And I think that approach has its downsides because it encourages us to wait for
Innovation.
the next download of Windows to solve all of our problems. And I don't think that's going to happen. But I think it's hard to look at his career and on balance not say he's been a positive force in the world.
I almost want to put a bookmark in that one because it's an interesting point you've just made. And
of course, he has been injected to all of our veins, Denny. So I have to say that.
For sure. Okay. All right. Yeah. And microchips too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've had 4 vaccines, so
right.
I'm probably overdosed by now.
Yeah. My chips are like crashing. Justin Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau is going to go down in history as one of Canada's best prime ministers. I really believe that. I think he's done remarkable things on all the big issues of the day. I don't know what else to say about him.
Joe Rogan.
I don't, it's funny. I've never listened to Joe Rogan's podcast. I'm certainly aware of all the criticisms of it. I really remember Joe Rogan as the Fear Factor guy.
For sure.
Which I was slightly addicted to in the 90s. My wife and I, then girlfriend, were both addicted to. So I don't really have an informed opinion.
Klaus Schwab.
Klaus Schwab, again, don't really know him that well. I've met him a couple of times. The World Economic Forum, I don't know what to say about it. The conspiracy theories that have come up about the World Economic Forum, having been there, they can organize a conference, but I can't see how they could organize a global conspiracy. I think it's risible.
So Winston Churchill, that's my last one.
Winston Churchill. I mean, he was wrong about a lot of things, except the most important thing that happened in his life, right?
Yeah.
So it's a remarkable leader who was uniquely capable of galvanizing his people at probably the most important inflection point in their history.
So the reason I want to do that is because I've kind of made this realization that you've got, and Winston Churchill kind of said this best: if you're 25 or younger and not a liberal, you have no heart. And if you're 35 and older and not a conservative, you have no brain. Now, it's an interesting conundrum because, I mean, we all know about the push and pull, the left. Mm-hmm. There's a need for both, let's say. And I think he embodies that. But one of the interesting things is he uses the word heart and he uses the word brain.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed, it seems, is that there's a certain amount of vitriol that gets thrown towards, let's say, the right wing, even in the ad hominems and things that we see to counter, maybe outspoken members of that side, that there's, I guess, more vitriol in some of those terms, Nazi, racist, et cetera, right? It's kind of got an evil connotation to it. But when we look back the other way, it seems more of the naive or wrong or silly or,
I'm not sure I'd agree with that generalization. It's maybe having been on the receiving end of
sure of enough of it.
I don't think it's that polite. I really don't.
Okay.
On the right wing, but look, I don't think that the level of political discourse that has been that has developed, especially in the United States, but to a lesser extent here in Canada and certainly in the UK, all across the Anglosphere. My Australian friends would remind me of what it sounds like there as well. I don't think it's been helpful, right?
Yeah.
I think it's an impediment to progress. I think that, especially for a country like Canada, where we're a relatively small but growing number of people on a huge landmass, we got to hang together, right? And so much of what has developed over the past 15 years since the advent of social media, the independent variable has been the weaponization of division, right?
Yeah.
Of there's been it's the coin of the realm is getting people angry, especially at each other, so that you can form tightly knit groups of online communities that exist largely to lob tomatoes at each other. And I don't think that's healthy for democracy.
Now, Ian Bremner, I listened to his TED Talk.
Mhm.
I thought it was really fascinating. He talks about the power balance in the world, and for those listeners not aware, Ian is a co-chair.
Ian's the founder and president of Eurasia Group.
Of Eurasia Group. Okay. And Ian, it's a really great TED Talks if anybody wants to listen, where he talks about the power balance, give or take in the world, the traditional sort of military power, let's say, in a more of a Machiavellian sense. And then you've got the
emergent technology companies as
right. That's what he lands on. Yeah. That's what he lands on. So he's got, the financial kind of fractioning of power in the last decade. Let's say United States had military strength and still was very dominant in a military capacity. Less so now in the recent years financially. Countries have been emerging, pockets have been emerging with financial independence, and they're not exerting military oppression, let's say, to get their way in the world of financial markets. And now this emergence of this new concern, which is the tech power. And so what are your thoughts on that? What do you think the main concern is? What scares you about big tech?
It's a great question. I'm not sure scares would be the right word. I think that geopolitics is ultimately about the distribution of power amongst large actors. Right. And small actors are important, especially within states. But among states, we're talking about who has the mass and gravitational field to affect other bodies around it. And Ian has been a pioneer in thinking about how the concentration of power amongst a few large tech platforms, Western platforms, but also importantly, Chinese platforms, that the power has become so large that they're beginning to exhibit the behavior we traditionally ascribe to states, right? So you think about a company like Meta, for instance. They create virtual space. They police who can be part of that space and who cannot. And they set the rules of engagement and interaction amongst the various actors who are on that space. That sounds, if you replace those bits and bytes with people, that sounds a lot like what states used to do exclusively, right? So I think
particularly authoritarian ones.
Well, all states. I mean, we in this country have a constitutional guideline and a body of law that would fill this room with acts and regulations, and then some, that at least theoretically and legally describe how you and I relate to each other. Right. And we're democratic. We're a democratic society. So we have conceded that territory to the state because for a lot of important reasons, we can't self-regulate that kind of behavior at a national scale. And I think what Ian noticed probably in the early part of the last decade was that large tech companies were starting to absorb many of those functions. And we're not in the business of making normative judgments about whether that's a good or a bad thing. Our fundamental raison d'etre at Eurasia Group is to understand what's a thing and what's not a thing. Right? Sure. It's not whether it's good or bad. And that is most definitely a thing. And it's changed the way we just talked about it. It's changed the way people within countries relate to one another as citizens and how they behave politically. The economic choices they make, fundamentally, the big platforms are clearing houses for advertising, and that's their economic model. So, we think we're a bit ahead of the curve in thinking about the consequences of all that.
Do you think freedom of speech is in jeopardy if big tech companies kind of...
Well, I think it's important, notwithstanding what I just said, especially in the United States, this point is confused a lot. The First Amendment does not apply to private
I
organizations,
won't
right?
go there.
So I think that there's been a co-option of the language of free speech by people whose version of free speech is pretty much, I should be free to say whatever I want. And
Sure.
that includes denigrating you and your race and your, sexual orientation and that kind of thing. And I think that's wrong. But I don't think it is ultimately. I think that it is potentially, but I have a lot, liberal democracies have been written off by their internal and external forces many times over the past 100 years. And their resilience is always surprising to their enemies. So I've got a lot of faith in constitutionally enshrined liberal democracies to defend themselves against those kinds of threats. None of that is to say the future is assured in that regard. But it's certainly true that in a country like Canada, citizens have all the tools they need to protect themselves against those kinds of threats. And I have a lot of faith in people that they will.
So, I mean, would it be fair to say, or would it be a leap to say that it would be okay to, or it would be a desired, let's say, to enshrine a lot of those principles that we covet in democracy in this new opt-in global power, this possible new form of government or de facto form of government?
I don't see it as a form of government. In fact, I think its power derives from the fact that it's not a form of government, that it's sort of absorbing the functions of government in different, not always positive ways, but that it's made the normative argument that they're better off unregulated, and that stifling innovation with regulation is a net negative for the economy and therefore society as a whole. I think that in the grand scheme of things, we'll look back on that period of history as sort of, the 1880s. It's like the robber barons building the railways, and then sensible people come along to clean up the mess afterward. And we're hopefully entering the period of sensible people.
Because obviously mining is very important to us. Yeah. So where do you see...
It's been very important to me. I come from a mining family.
Of course.
My dad was a coal miner.
Yeah. So where do you see, I mean, obviously this new transition plan is very exciting for the mining industry. Yep. And I think the mining industry's done a really good job in the sense that I've looked at the ESG scores of a variety of different companies. And so one of my big bugaboos, I guess, was that mining companies were getting a bad rap, kind of getting tossed around between the left and the right on this argument, almost as like if you want to build all these solar panels and wind turbines, it's going to cost you this mining. And then the other, so mining kind of seems to get a bad rap. But in my purview, as far as ESG is concerned, we do baseline studies, remediation plans. I mean, social engagement with First Nations groups, local groups, etc. I mean, very few companies have that mapped out. And to be a mine, you have to have that mapped out.
Yeah, and you do here.
Well, and internationally.
Yes, because no. I mean, I think I'm a booster of the mining sector. I think it's a hugely important part of the Canadian and global economy, and it's got an opportunity to be an enormous part of the climate solution, right? So, all of that said, I just don't think it's fair to say that everyone's a good actor in all cases, right?
There's no good actors in all cases of anything, so that's suffices to say. But I think from the commercial mining perspective. Now, one last question, because I know you're out of time. Climate action, we talked about the shock of all of putting this through. That shock has been real and measured by a lot of Canadians. People are concerned about things like carbon taxes. And I know short on time, it's going to limit your ability to respond to this. But, carbon taxes has been something that people are concerned about as an intervention, a financial kind of solution.
Yeah, sure.
Bill Gates has criticized it.
It's super important to recognize that most Canadians get more money back from the price on carbon than they pay. And that's, I know people want to argue that that's not the case, but the math suggests otherwise. So I think that's a really important point. People are always going to recognize the price they pay at the cash register.
Yeah.
But it's, most people get more in the rebates, which are now, I don't know if it's been a while since I've been there. They used to be annual. I think they might be quarterly now, that they get back from the government. So I think I don't know. There's a lot of bullshit about this topic.
And there's inflationary forces, there's carbon, there's all these sorts of things,
Yes.
right? Energy costs are higher today than they were, right? Fair
Totally.
enough.
But that's because of the war in Ukraine. It's not because of climate action.
Fair enough. Now, 1 in 4 children in the country are living in food insecurity. There's been this growing explosion, upwards to 20% of people in Canada going to food banks. I mean, It's absolutely absurd. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in reviewing all this, I was like, holy crap, that's an insane number.
Cost of living is a real problem.
And the cost of living and groceries at the grocery shelf are expensive.
Absolutely.
I mean, they get trucked around, and when we add costs to things, they get pushed back down on the products and things. And so, whether we want to sit there, like we want to sit with each other and say, well, we can blame COVID, we can blame supply chain issues that emanated out of COVID, we can blame, the war in Ukraine. A lot of people are going to sit there at home around their dinner table and say, they're going to cast stones at spending money on things like supporting the war in Ukraine or like
absolutely.
Carbon taxes and things like that, right?
For sure. That's their absolute right as citizens of a democratic country to disagree with any policy measure the government may take. My point, and it's a really simple one, is that there are people who are against significant climate action in the country who are choosing, even though they know better, to ascribe to that action the blame for all of those cost of living increases. And even though inflation in Canada has been roughly in line with every other country in the G7, if anything, it's been a little more moderate, which is, cold comfort to people who are paying, I think this morning's figure was a 9% increase in grocery bills again. All of these things are happening, and you can't pretend they're not happening. But it's irresponsible to ascribe the blame for them to a net positive policy that is not their cause.
I guess the opposition would say, the opposition to this would say that, if you, let's say you tax, you apply, you make energy costs more expensive, let's just say, right? So the trucking companies that transport food, the grocery store companies that store them, et cetera.
I'm very familiar with the argument.
And they push those costs down to the products. They don't absorb them. And so it's like, well, it'd be hard to untangle. I agree with you. There's a lot of factors. It's a multivariate issue, just like climate is. It'd be hard to untangle.
And not all of those factors are of equal weight.
No, for sure. They never are. Right. And so it'd be hard to untangle it. But I think one of the interesting things is like, I think Fraser Institute said that out of the 11% costs of food increases, 3% was attributed to carbon taxes. Now,
when the Fraser Institute publicizes its sources of funding, I will take its studies seriously.
Okay. Fair enough. So anyways, just kind of that's going to be a point people are going to say. And so I'm just
totally
curious.
Agree. That was a primary argument in the last 3 elections, and I'm sure it'll be an argument in the next election. It's incumbent upon the incumbents to make the alternative case, right? Which is, if you're worried about child poverty in Canada, then you should be a full-throated supporter of the Canada Child Benefit, which did more to alleviate child poverty than any single policy in the history of the country. And the opposition opposed it.
Yeah.
So, I think people are smart. I'm definitely from the people are not stupid school of politics. And if you make robust arguments over concrete issues, then people are more than equipped to determine who is really speaking to their interest and who isn't. So I get the point about energy cost increases. I think, I know it has a lot more to do with dislocations, both from COVID and from the war in Ukraine, than it does with any domestic policy, the carbon price or otherwise.
Well, I think, Gerry, I think the one point, I guess, to kind of maybe linger on is we've got a lot of swinging in Europe we've had an economic shock with a lot of these transition plans, and we've had the pendulum swing to the right in a lot of nations. Do we think that that's something that
Well, it could happen anywhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have had the swing to the right, but we've also had a counterbalance to the left. I'll be very interested to see what happens in the UK election, for instance, a year from now. Emmanuel Macron was reelected, Joe Biden won, Bolsonaro lost. Like there's the evidence is not clear cut in one direction or the other. And I think every situation is subject to its own domestic forces, which ultimately trump, pardon the pun, anything that's going on internationally.
Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on the show. I couldn't imagine a more difficult time to be navigating the waters of geopolitics today.
It's a great time to be navigating them if if you're being paid to analyze them and not do something about it.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again. Thanks for Gerry.
Real
for taking
pleasure,
the time.
David.
Yeah, really pleasure.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye.